Greetings, students. I'm hoping that you have some time to watch through this video with a group of friends and we can connect to some of the themes we've been talking about previously. So last time in class we were talking about coevolution as related to predators and prey. Today we're going to talk about coevolution of another sort. We're first going to start to talk a little bit more, though we've referred to this many times in the class, about coevolution between herbivores and plants. And then we're going to finish with talking about coevolution among mutualists, two species that cooperate together. So while we were talking about predators and prey, one of the things that was obvious was that prey try to defend themselves against predators. What might be less obvious to you is that plants equally have co-evolved to try to defend themselves against herbivores. And so there are a variety of categories of plant herbivore coevolution that plants have used to prevent themselves from being overexploited by herbivores. And the first is simply called deterrence. One of the examples of deterrence is something we call structural defense. As you can see here in the photograph, this particular plant has spines on it that help prevent herbivores from easily consuming the plant. And it's a way that coevolution through time, in the presence of herbivores, the plants that had thornier tissues were able to survive better in the presence of herbivores. So thorns and spines are usually an indication of a fair amount of herbivore pressure through evolutionary time. But we've also discussed another pretty impressive plant defense mechanism. As we talked about, plants are producing glucose from photosynthetic processes, and this is a very valuable energy source. So plants have evolved ways to try to protect that glucose from being eaten by consumers. And one of the ways they've done that is through the evolution of resistant chemicals to digestion, such as cellulose. Lignin is another example. Lignin is a cellulose-like structure too that is common in plants. And so this really prevents most herbivores from being able to digest the material unless they have beneficial microbes like we've talked about with fermentation processes. Some plants even have silica in them. As you might be aware, silica is in silicon dioxide, which is another word for crystal quartz. Silica you could think of as being hard like sand, and some plants actually have absorbed silica from the soil into their tissue, and it's thought that this helps decrease digestibility. Another example of deterrence is chemical defenses. There are a ton of plant secondary compounds that plants have evolved to prevent digestion or to, in fact, poison the herbivores that are trying to eat them. Sometimes it makes the plant toxic, or in other cases, it just makes it harder to digest. So chemical defenses is a whole area in ecology that would be an example of plant-herbivore coevolution. Not all plants try to deter herbivores. Some simply try to tolerate herbivores. And so a second category of plant-herbivore interaction is the fact that some plants have evolved the ability to regrow back quickly after being eaten. And so if you look here to the right, you'll see that if a plant is undefoliated, it invests without being grazed or browsed upon by animals. This is the amount of allocation that it produces into its root system, which is quite high. But when it gets defoliated, it switches energy from allocating it to its roots, and it starts to allocate it to its leaves. So many plants do this. Grasses in particular are highly evolved to compensate after grazing, and so we find that in the presence of grazers, roots don't grow as deep, but plants then invest that same amount of energy into returning their leaf material above ground so that they can use photosynthesis to regrow. So remember, though, that if we're talking about coevolution, we're not just talking about plants defending themselves from herbivores. We're talking about herbivores also co-evolving to try to make do with the plant defenses. And so there are a variety of ways animals do that. They can select plants that aren't chemically defended or don't have spines and thorns. That's what we mean by plant selectivity. you and I tend to think of herbivores as indiscriminate consumers of all kinds of plant material. Well, that's just not the case. They're very discriminating. Sometimes they eat only certain plant parts. Sometimes they'll avoid certain species which they know to be unpalatable. And many insects have actually evolved a whole chemical arsenal to detoxify the plant secondary compounds that are made to defend them, to defend the plants. And so there's this coevolution between insects and plants. And really, it's a chemical arms race to see selection pressures favoring the plants that mutate and the insects that mutate to produce chemicals that are able to tolerate the chemicals that they are ingesting. And of course, as you see here in the right, don't forget fermentation is a coevolutionary strategy to tolerate the structural defense that most plants have in the form of cellulose, where they trap their glucose into these very difficult to digest molecules. So using bacteria that can digest the cellulose, that's an example of coevolution. So the ruminants spread and diversified quite well in evolutionary time because they were able to access energy that other herbivores weren't able to access. It is, however, thought that rumination first evolved to actually help detoxify plant food, and then maybe only was co-opted into digesting cellulose later in the evolutionary record. And as you're aware, due to Kleiber's law, bigger body sizes are able to detoxify hard-to-digest cellulose better and to digest it better because of their long fermentation times. Now, what I'd like you to do is, if you're with a group of people, I would like you to pause the video here, and I want you to go to your textbook, and I want you to read the section about host-parasite coevolution. We're going to switch gears a little bit before we get into mutualistic coevolutionary patterns and talk a little bit about parasitism and disease. There's some fascinating case studies where creatures that interact with one another and share potential sections of their life cycle together have co-evolved to tolerate diseases, but also the pathogenic organism has evolved strategies to make it more likely that the organism gets passed from one part of the food chain to another. So I'd like you to pause the video and go to the text and read again the section about trematode life cycle evolution with hosts and parasites, and then have a little discussion about these 3 bullet points. So I'll let you pause. Okay, welcome back. I think perhaps found that interesting. There are other examples of host-parasite coevolution that also your text refers to. While we don't have time to dig into the details, I want you to be aware that there's this whole other coevolutionary subset of interactions with disease ecology. One of the most fascinating visual examples of this is a host-parasite coevolutionary process between a fungus, a kind of rust, and a particular plant, buttercup. And what the fungus does is it actually forces the plant to produce what's called a pseudoflower. It's actually not a flower, but it's a false flower. And that flower still attracts pollinators. The pollinators can't tell the difference between the real flower that the plant produces nectar from and this fake flower that is grown by the plant, actually induced by the fungus. So in a way, this is a fungal outbreak on the plant that through evolutionary timescales has evolved to look like a flower. Therefore, insects come and think that this is a flower that they can pollinate. They scavenge around on here, but in the process, they spread the spores of this fungus to another plant. And so that would be a pretty classic example of host-parasite coevolutionary processes. Now we want to shift gears to the main topic of today, which is to talk about mutualisms. So I'd first like to divide positive interactions or mutualistic interactions into 3 broad categories. We should first start to say that mutualisms are simply a relationship between 2 species where they both benefit to some degree. So when that benefit is broadly shared and they're There's some benefit from species A to species B. We call it simply facilitation. It's not very species specific. You could have a facilitative interaction with almost any other species. A facultative mutualism, however, is species specific. That's just between two different species, and it's a more tightly co-evolved relationship, but it's not required for each of those species to survive. If those two species are present, they both benefit to some degree, but they can survive independent of their mutualistic partner. And the most narrowly, tightly evolved example of a mutualistic relationship is what we call an obligate mutualism. And that's also species specific as our facultative mutualisms, but the species can't survive without its mutualistic partner. And I'm going to go through an example using these photos down here at the bottom of each of these. So before we get into these three examples, I want to remind you about the way that competition and facilitation and mutualisms differ in how they affect two species interacting. So on the left-hand side, you might recall that there's a difference between what we think of as the fundamental niche and the realized niche. The fundamental niche is all of the area of resources that a species requires to survive. But due to competition, the realized niche is smaller than the fundamental niche. Okay, we discussed that in a previous set of lectures. On the other hand, if positive interactions, like facilitation, are in effect, the realized niche is actually bigger than the fundamental niche. So in this case, the places that an animal or plant could live are increased when their partner is around. And I want to show you a few examples of that. It can be due to predation refuge or habitat improvements, resource enhancement, getting access to resources that were unavailable when your mutualistic partner is not present. So let's go through some examples of facilitation. So here's an example of some trees out in the Pacific Northwest. This is called a nurse log. This is a log that fell over. It's now laying on the ground. It's probably been there for hundreds of years. And it was a massive tree, probably several hundred feet tall. And when it fell down, it serves as a nutrient reservoir for seeds that fall on top of it. So later in time, a little pine cone fell down and started to grow on top of this nurse log. And this log, in fact, facilitated the growth of another tree. You might remember this is in contrast to the circumstance where some adult trees compete with the offspring around them. And there's coevolutionary relationships using squirrels and other things to disperse these seeds far from the parent because the parent and the offspring are competing. In this case, particularly when the tree falls over, it may or may not be dead right when it falls over. This can be an example of facilitation. This tree here, its roots are helping hold in soil all around it. In fact, that tree then may, in fact, facilitate the growth of smaller plants around it rather than compete with them. And here's an example in a dry desert environment where water is very limited. These plants, there's probably 3 different species here, are helping facilitate one another. So rather than being crowded out by competition, these plants are helping hold moisture into the soil and, in fact, help each other. And that would be an example of where the realized niche is getting bigger due to a mutualistic interaction. In this case, we experience the opposite of what we found in the competition equations with Volterra. We actually find something called positive density dependence. In other words, as the density of a species gets higher, it performs better, not worse. So in the sense, we usually find positive density dependence in examples that are really, really stressful. So sometimes crowding in these stressful situations can actually lead to individually higher fitness. We find examples of this in the tidal zones where animals are really stressed out by the fact that the water's going up and down and they're experiencing 6 hours of drying out between low and high tides. In the case where barnacles, for example, are very crowded, they actually survive through those low tides better than if they're not crowded. Let's talk then about some facultative mutualism. So here we have some bison with cowbirds on top of the bison. These cowbirds are eating the ticks